even hoping her father would become enraged enough to kill him. What she hadn't expected was that Richard Blake had immense trust in Ethan Blake and wouldn't even entertain her accusations. In fact, for an instant, he had displayed a murderous intent that left her heart still pounding with fear. "Susan, I have something to ask you." While Susan Blake was still trembling in dread, Richard Blake's voice suddenly thundered in her ears, startling her so much that she nearly collapsed to the ground. "Could father have found out? What should I do now? Will he kill me? I'm his biological daughter." Susan Blake's mind buzzed as memories flooded back, especially since Sophia Blake's birth. Her father's affection for her had noticeably waned. There were even times when he had scolded her harshly, making her feel as though the bond between them was slipping away. "Fine, just kill me. Father doesn't love me anymore anyway," Susan Blake thought in despair. "Susan, stop zoning out. The Duke is calling you," the Duchess beside her reminded gently. "Hey." Susan Blake awoke abruptly, her expression vacant. Seeing Richard Blake flick his sleeves and leave the main tent, she quietly followed behind him, her petite figure appearing somewhat desolate. Watching the father and daughter of the Blake family depart, Ethan Blake fell into deep thought, shook his head, and dismissed his suspicions. He glanced at Sophia Blake, who was lying on the mat with steady breathing. The dark aura had dissipated, and she seemed temporarily fine. With that, he excused himself from those around him, and walked out alone. Susan Blake's earlier accusations had caused everyone in the royal residence to look at him with strange eyes, making him feel uneasy. Leaving early seemed like the best choice. "Young Master Ethan, please wait. I have something to consult with you about." The deputy imperial physician, seeing Ethan Blake leaving, hurriedly called out and quickly followed after him. Now that Sophia Blake appeared to be out of danger, the people around gradually dispersed. After all, the Duke of the Northern Frontier had already left, so there was no longer anything to fear. In the end, only the 4 Owen Blake brothers and a few maids remained in the large tent, standing guard to prevent any unexpected incidents. The first day of the spring hunting event had already seen so much turmoil, leaving everyone deeply unsettled. It was as though a massive dark cloud silently loomed over the Northern Frontier Duke's residence. ### Chapter 35 Disaster Strikes. Western Literary Mountain, at the beginning of spring and during dusk, appeared particularly tranquil. In the spring hunting camp of the Northern Frontier Duke, torches were lit, illuminating a vast area. About 2 to 3 miles away from the camp was a low hill, covered with bushes just beginning to sprout. The overlapping shadows of the trees created an air of mystery. Jake Paul hid beneath a tree, gazing at the lights in the camp, feeling a bit restless. Initially, he had planned to take advantage of the spring hunt to conspire with Princess Susan to eliminate Ethan Blake. However, unexpected events kept occurring, even harming Sophia Blake, something he had never intended. "Humph. That brat Ethan Blake is truly lucky. It seems tonight I'll have to rely on Mr. Carter to make another move." Jake Paul's facial muscles twitched, his hatred for Ethan Blake growing deeper. The enmity between him and Ethan Blake stemmed entirely from Princess Susan. As long as Ethan Blake was eliminated, he could win Princess Susan's favor and bring her home as his bride. "Susan!" Thinking of Princess Susan, Jake Paul suddenly felt his whole body heat up. Her voluptuous figure appeared vividly in his mind. Even though their moments of intimacy were separated by layers of clothing, her youthful, vibrant body filled him with endless longing. "Heh. Once this is over, I'll beg my father to propose marriage to her family. These past years have been so torturous." Jake Paul licked his lips, his eyes narrowing slightly. His mind was consumed with images of passionate moments with Princess Susan. Whoosh! A gentle breeze passed by, and a faint shadow quietly appeared behind him. Feeling a chill creep up his neck, Jake Paul snapped back to reality. He turned around and saw Darren Paul, the man who had attacked Ethan Blake earlier that day, standing there looking at him. "Apologies for keeping you waiting, Your Highness," Darren Paul said casually. Though his tone was polite, his face betrayed an unmistakable arrogance. "I have just arrived as well. No need to be so formal, sir," Jake Paul quickly said. The other party was a cultivator, far beyond what someone like him, merely a noble scion, could compare to. He dared not show the slightest delay. "All right then, what brings you to me this time?" Darren Paul asked. "Sir, the one poisoned by the heavenly venom earlier today, he's completely fine now, alive and well," Jake Paul cautiously replied. "Oh!" Darren Paul raised an eyebrow, his expression showing disbelief. Before Jake Paul could speak further, he said, "Wait for me here for a moment. I'll be back soon." With that, his figure dissolved into a wisp of light smoke, drifting toward the camp of the northern frontier king. Jake Paul let out a cold laugh, muttering to himself, "Ethan Blake, this time you're doomed." At the spring hunting camp of the northern frontier king, torches burned brightly as teams of 10 soldiers marched in unison, patrolling the area. Inside the various tents, shadows moved about. These were individuals closely tied to the royal household, gathered together, chatting about the events of the day. In the main tent of the northern frontier king, the atmosphere was heavy. The 4 Blake brothers and Ethan Blake stood off to the side, their gazes fixed on Susan Blake, who knelt trembling in the center. Richard Blake sat upright at the head of the room, his face dark and brooding as he toyed with a jade teacup in his hand. His lips pressed into a thin line, and he remained silent for a long time. Susan Blake knelt below, her body shaking, her face pale as paper. Her beautiful eyes were filled with terror as she kept her head bowed, not daring to meet the eyes of anyone else in the tent. After what felt like an eternity, Richard Blake finally spoke in a hoarse voice. "Susan, you have deeply disappointed your father." Hearing her father finally break the silence, Susan Blake's entire body trembled. She sobbed, "Father, I know I was wrong. Please forgive me." Humph. Richard Blake slammed the jade cup in his hand onto the ground, shattering it into countless pieces. His voice was icy cold. "You conspired with outsiders to harm your own brother. How can I possibly forgive you? This morning, you repeatedly slandered and framed Ethan. Do you think I didn't see through such childish schemes? I even gave you a warning. Yet, you remained obstinate and unrepentant. You even sought out a cycle of Souls Order monk to assassinate Ethan. Tell me, what am I supposed to do with you now? I was wrong. I was wrong. It was all Jake Paul's doing. He still harbors resentment towards brother Ethan. I was deceived by his sweet words, momentarily blinded, and caused this disaster." Susan Blake kowtowed repeatedly, shifting all the blame onto Jake Paul. Earlier, after Sophia Blake took the rejuvenation pill, her condition improved significantly. Richard Blake had called her aside to speak privately. With just a few words, he had pressured her into revealing the entire truth. However, Richard Blake did not say much at the time, and instead told her to go back and rest. Unexpectedly, after dinner, he came to settle the score. "Humph. That brat Jake Paul. I'll deal with his father myself. But your actions have left Sophia in a coma, her life or death uncertain. If I don't punish you, how will I face her?" Richard Blake's cold voice was like a dagger stabbing straight into Susan Blake's chest, causing her to collapse to the ground instantly. "Your Grace." Just as Susan Blake was drowning in despair, Ethan Blake stepped forward and said, "Elder Sister Susan was also deceived by Jake Paul. Please, Your Grace, don't pursue this matter further. Ethan, Susan acted recklessly and caused a great disaster, yet you're asking me to forgive her?" Richard Blake's expression softened slightly as he questioned. Ethan, Your Highness, has no personal animosity with Sister Susan. It all stems from the conflict 7 years ago with Jake Paul. If accountability is pursued, Ethan will inevitably be implicated. I beg Your Highness to punish Ethan as well. After speaking, Ethan Blake also knelt down. Although he knew very well that everything was caused by Susan Blake, he considered that she was a blood relative of the Blake family, and the beloved daughter of the Northern Frontier Duke. If she were to be executed for this, the family would surely harbor resentment against him. This seemed like a better option. Rather than pleading directly for Susan Blake, it gave the father and daughter a way to de-escalate the situation. As Ethan Blake knelt, Richard Blake's expression shifted slightly, his eyes gleaming with amusement. Seeing this, the 4 brothers of Owen Blake quickly knelt as well, speaking in unison. Father, please spare Susan. Susan Blake kowtowed repeatedly, continuously apologizing. Humph. Richard Blake let out a deep sigh, thought for a moment, and said, Since you've all pleaded on her behalf, I'll spare her life. However, while the death penalty is waived, punishment cannot be avoided. Susan, after this spring hunt, you are to remain in the estate and reflect on your actions until the day of your marriage. I understand, Father. Susan Blake immediately sighed in relief. 2 daughters, both equally precious. For Richard Blake, this was a difficult decision. Yet, he couldn't openly shield Susan Blake without drawing criticism, so he reluctantly played the role of a stern father in front of Owen Blake and his brothers, hoping they would intercede for her. What surprised him, however, was that the first to plead was Ethan Blake. Internally, Richard couldn't help but admire him and feel a sense of relief. What parent could truly bear to harm their own child? Very well, all of you may leave now, Richard Blake said, dismissing them with a weary wave of his hand. Everyone immediately stood up and excused themselves, heading out of the tent. Owen, stay behind. Your father has a few words to discuss with you. Just as they reached the entrance, Richard Blake spoke again, stopping Owen Blake. Once everyone had left, leaving only father and son in the tent, Richard Blake furrowed his brows and spoke in a low voice. Owen, today's matter concerns the reputation of the Northern Guardian Duke's household. What do you think we should do? Owen Blake froze for a moment before replying. Father, wasn't Susan already pardoned? Humph. Richard Blake let out a cold laugh. Everyone with eyes can see what Susan has done. Now, if I let her go without consequence, rumors will spread once we return, saying that I, Richard Blake, am shielding my daughter. This... Father, what do you mean? Owen's entire body trembled as he quickly grasped the meaning behind Richard Blake's sharp gaze. Exactly. Just as you think. We need someone to take the blame, and that person will be Jake Paul. Among the participants in this spring hunt, there are many disciples from prominent families. As long as Susan points him out and the evidence is solid, even if I kill Jake Paul, his father will have no choice but to swallow his anger. Humph, with the power of the Dew family, they wouldn't dare act against me, Richard Blake said slowly. Owen Blake broke out in a cold sweat, standing frozen for a long time. Owen, to accomplish great things, one must not only have the heart to embrace the world but also be decisive. This is something you must learn from Ethan, Richard Blake said, patting Owen on the shoulder, his tone heavy with meaning. But the world is unpredictable, and not everything is within one's control. Early the next morning, just as dawn broke, Owen Blake was still in a deep sleep when he was startled awake by the sound of chaotic footsteps outside his tent. He quickly dressed and went out to investigate. He saw the patrolling soldiers looking panicked, all heading toward the tent of the Northern Guardian Duke. Grabbing one of the soldiers, he asked, "What's going on?" The soldier, recognizing Owen Blake, hurriedly replied, "Young master, something has happened." The young master of the Du family was found dead right at the entrance of the camp. His body has been brought back, and the Duke is currently examining it. What? Jake Paul is dead. Owen Blake was shocked. His father's plan was to gather everyone later today, expose Jake Paul's crimes, and then deal with him. How could he already be dead? Without hesitation, he rushed to the Northern Guardian Duke's tent, pushing through the crowd of soldiers gathered at the entrance, and stepped inside. Jake Paul's lifeless body lay on the ground, a large bloodstain on his chest, no longer breathing. The deputy physician was carefully examining the corpse to determine the cause of death. Richard Blake's face was grim as he paced back and forth. When he saw Owen Blake enter, he slowly shook his head, indicating it wasn't his doing. Jake Paul's mysterious death in the spring hunting camp had effectively sealed the feud with the Du family. If Jake Paul had been killed by the Northern Frontier King for plotting against the Blake family's heir and princess, at least in terms of reason, the Blake family would hold the moral high ground, leaving the Du family in no position to openly challenge them. However, the current circumstances were highly unfavorable. Jake Paul had been murdered, and worse, he died right in the middle of the spring hunting camp, making it incredibly difficult to explain to the Du family. Richard Blake continued pacing until his gaze finally landed on Ethan Blake, standing amidst the crowd, watching the commotion with a curious expression. Suspicion filled his eyes. Sensing Richard Blake's doubtful stare, Ethan Blake immediately lifted his head and met his gaze directly, signaling that he had nothing to do with Jake Paul's death. After a long pause, Richard Blake let out a sigh, withdrew his gaze, and asked, "Deputy Physician, what was the cause of young Master Du's death?" "Your Highness, young Master Du was killed by a shattered heart." Deputy Imperial Physician straightened up and respectfully replied, "A shattered heart? Then it must have been the work of a martial arts master. Who exactly did this?" "First, they attempted to assassinate my child, and now they've killed the heir of the Du family. Do they truly believe that by doing so, they can defeat me, Richard Blake?" Richard Blake suddenly raised his voice, his gaze sweeping across the crowd in the grand tent, as if trying to uncover the culprit. Chapter 36, Annihilation of the Clan. A series of misfortunes occurred, and now with someone dead, it was naturally impossible to continue the spring hunt. Immediately, Richard Blake issued an order to break camp and return to the capital. Once back at the royal residence, a thorough investigation into the matter would be conducted. Additionally, he sent someone to inform the Du family, as they deserved an explanation no matter the circumstances. In short, the entire Northern Duke's household hurriedly returned to the grand capital. Before even entering the royal residence, Richard Blake went directly to the palace to meet the emperor, hoping to secure some advantage for himself. The rest of the household carried heavy hearts. Each retreated to their respective quarters, only daring to whisper about the events of the spring hunt in private. As for Sophia Blake, she remained unconscious. The effects of the heavenly venom smoke were temporarily suppressed, but only the arrival of someone from Virtue Keep could provide a cure. Ethan Blake returned to the Rising Sun courtyard, his mind filled with countless unanswered questions. Who had killed Jake Paul? What was the perpetrator's true motive? Were they targeting him, Ethan Blake, or the Northern Duke? Dust swirled along the road as maids, already informed of Ethan Blake's return, prepared wine and food in advance. Deep in thought, Ethan Blake barely noticed as Third Blake and the maids brought the refreshments. Sigh. I fear this time something major will unfold within the household. Ethan Blake lamented silently. And so, several days passed. During this time, the Du family sent people to retrieve Jake Paul's body, but their specific attitude remained unclear. Even in court, everything seemed as calm as ever, as though the incident had never occurred. Having weathered countless storms, Richard Blake knew this matter wouldn't simply end here. He remained cautious, even bringing highly skilled guards with him to court, wary of potential assassination attempts. 8 days later, Virtue Keep indeed sent someone. Ethan Blake didn't know who it was, only hearing that the visitor was a stunningly beautiful woman. She stayed in Sophia Blake's room for 3 days, before leaving as mysteriously as she had arrived. Shortly after her departure, the effects of the heavenly venom smoke on Sophia Blake were completely cured, and she returned to her former state of health. Susan Blake rarely ventured out, and was seldom seen by others in the household. Though people were curious, they paid it little mind. Once recovered, Sophia Blake clung to Ethan Blake daily, asking to train together. Her physical condition improved significantly, and Ethan Blake patiently taught her basic techniques from a scripture. Over time, she made noticeable progress and gained a solid foundation. Meanwhile, the 4 Owen Blake brothers frequently visited Ethan Blake, strengthening their bond. Connor Blake, in particular, often came by to learn from Ethan Blake, much to Sophia Blake's annoyance. Everything seemed to return to its original course, unfolding slowly. In just 2 more months, Virtue Keep would arrive to select new disciples. Today, after finishing his training, Ethan Blake felt invigorated, his entire body brimming with boundless energy. Standing by the small lake, he couldn't help but let out 3 loud shouts in succession. Overcome with excitement, he leaped forward, stepping onto the stone bridge, and within moments, he arrived at the gazebo in the middle of the lake. The misty vapor surrounding the area carried a refreshing and pure fragrance. Breathing it in brought a sense of relaxation and calmness. Feeling inspired, Ethan assumed a stance and began practicing his martial techniques within the gazebo. Powerful gusts of energy radiated outward from the gazebo, rippling across the lake's surface and stirring gentle waves. Whoosh! Suddenly, a streak of sword light, like a white ribbon, flashed across the sky, accompanied by the sound of wind slicing through the air, reaching Ethan's ears. A cultivator flying on a sword. Ethan quickly stepped out of the gazebo and looked up at the sky, his face filled with astonishment. In just the blink of an eye, hundreds of streaks of sword light, each glowing in various colors, flew in from afar and hovered in the air above the northern Duke's estate. Are those people from Virtue Keep? Ethan furrowed his brows. Although his senses had become much sharper after practicing the Codex of Might, the brilliance of the sword lights in the sky was blinding, making it impossible to discern the situation clearly. Young Master Ethan, young Master. Ethan! Princess Sophia has arrived. At that moment, Trucy called out from beside the lake in a crisp voice. Got it. Ethan responded, leaping back to the lakeside. There he saw Sophia Blake, dressed in a purple gauze gown, standing and gazing up at the sky. Princess Sophia, skipping practice today, are we? That's being lazy. Ethan teased with a smile. Unexpectedly, Sophia Blake replied with a serious expression. Not today. I didn't even get a chance to practice before Father summoned me and gave me a long list of instructions. I see. Ethan nodded. Matters between a father and daughter were naturally not something he would pry into. Ethan, why are there so many sword lights in the sky? Sophia asked, her beautiful face tilted upward as she looked at the scene above, seemingly uninterested in discussing her father's summons. Those are the flying swords of cultivators. I'm guessing they must be people from Virtue Keep. Ethan replied. Strange, isn't it? There are still 2 months left before their selection day. Why have they come so early? I don't know either. Come, let's have some snacks together. Ethan Blake felt a tinge of doubt in his heart, but couldn't figure out the reason. He pulled Sophia Blake back to the room and ordered someone to bring various snacks. The two sat down to eat and chat. Boom! Suddenly, a deafening explosion roared like thunder on a clear day. Even the two-storied building where Ethan Blake resided shook violently. The two, who were enjoying their snacks, jumped up in shock. "This is bad. Something's happened." Third Blake's voice echoed from outside the door, and soon he stumbled into the room, looking utterly disheveled. The moment he saw Ethan Blake, he burst into tears. "Young Master Ethan, run quickly. Something terrible has happened at the royal manor." "What exactly happened?" Ethan Blake's heart sank, a foreboding feeling rising within him. Could it be that the sword lights filling the sky weren't from the Virtue Keep? "My dear young master." Just now, a massive sword light suddenly appeared in the sky and flattened the entire eastern part of the royal manor. Third Blake's face was pale with terror, his body trembling uncontrollably, and his lips were turning blue. "Everyone living in the east, they've all been turned into minced flesh. Blood everywhere, sob, sob." "What about my father?" Sophia Blake's face turned as white as a sheet of paper. She asked the question, and then immediately tried to rush outside. Ethan Blake grabbed her firmly and said, "Princess Sophia, let me go check." Third Blake, "Stay here with the princess." With that, his figure flashed, and he darted out of the room. Looking up, he saw that the eastern part of the royal manor had become a sea of flames. The raging fire was spreading rapidly toward the central area of the manor. Glancing again at the sword lights in the sky, they still hovered in midair, seemingly observing the situation below. "Not Virtue Keep, then who could it be?" Ethan Blake moved like lightning, taking a deep breath as he leaped dozens of meters forward, heading straight for the center of the Duke's manor. That area was not only where the Duke of the North resided, but also where Owen Blake's 4 brothers stayed. With such a sudden upheaval, it was uncertain whether they were in danger. Along the way, countless servants fled in panic, some even running out of the manor entirely. In the face of life and death, survival took precedence above all else. Ethan Blake's movements were swift, and in the blink of an eye, he arrived in front of a grand hall. He still remembered this place vividly. It was where Richard Blake had once carried him into the manor, a place Richard often stayed. Whoosh! Just as he was about to reach the hall's entrance, a piercing sound suddenly echoed from the sky. Following that, a sword beam, hundreds of meters long and tens of meters wide, slashed down abruptly. A scorching heatwave descended from above, rolling down with immense intensity. Sensing imminent danger, Ethan Blake reacted in less than a fraction of a second, his figure darting swiftly to the side. Moments later, a deafening explosion erupted, accompanied by the trembling of the ground. The grand hall was reduced to dust, and an enormous fissure appeared on the ground. Servants who failed to evade in time didn't even have the chance to scream. They were instantly reduced to mangled flesh and blood, scattered into the air. What was even more terrifying was that from the fissure, a fiery dragon emerged, roaring and rampaging through the manor. Wherever it passed, blazing flames erupted. "They want to destroy the entire Duke of the North's manor. This is bad. Sophia is in danger." Ethan Blake hesitated briefly before decisively turning around. He leaped over the fissure, heading toward the rising sun courtyard. Fortunately, the figure hovering in the sky did not unleash continuous sword beams. After releasing a second strike, they fell silent once more. However, Ethan Blake knew that it was only a matter of time before another devastating sword beam would target the rising sun courtyard. If they didn't evade in time, death was inevitable. At this moment, his figure moved so quickly that it left everyone astonished. The panicked servants, fleeing in chaos, could only feel a gust of wind pass by, unable to clearly see Ethan Blake's form. Running frantically, he finally returned to the radiant sun courtyard. Seeing everyone gathered there, the 4 maidservants were sobbing quietly. Among them, 2 had husbands who were serving their master in the eastern part of the royal residence, and it was likely they had met a grim fate. "I don't know who attacked the royal residence," Those people are cultivators, and we have no way to resist them. We should escape, Ethan Blake said, as he quickly began packing his belongings. The Codex of Might and the items acquired from William Ford were always kept close. He swiftly gathered his things, tied them into a bundle, and immediately pulled Sophia Blake along as they rushed outside. Third Blake led the 4 maidservants closely behind them. "Ethan Blake, where is my father? Where are my brothers?" Sophia Blake cried out as Ethan Blake dragged her out of the room. She caught sight of the royal residence engulfed in raging flames, with a faint image of a fire dragon circling above. Overcome with despair, she burst into tears. "They've likely met a grim end." Ethan Blake thought of the bond he shared with the Blake brothers, and his heart was filled with a complex mix of emotions. However, having been resilient and composed since childhood, he remained far calmer than the others in this dire situation. "I want to go find them." Sophia Blake struggled to pull her hand away from Ethan Blake's grip, but his strength was overwhelming. Unable to break free, she could only cry out loudly in protest. "Don't panic, protect your lives. Even if the Blake family's Duke is watching over them from the heavens, they will find solace," Ethan Blake reassured, but his steps did not falter as he led the group toward the rear gate of the Blake estate. Whoosh, whoosh. This time, 2 consecutive blasts echoed as 2 massive sword lights descended once more, completely obliterating what remained of the Blake estate. Pavilions and towers collapsed with a thunderous roar, and the entirety of the estate was engulfed in a sea of flames. At the same time, the sword lights hovering in midair suddenly rained down like a storm, plunging into the inferno below. Each beam of sword light carried a black-robed cultivator standing atop it. The moment they spotted any survivors, their swords struck mercilessly, turning the once magnificent Northern Duke's Blake estate into nothing but ashes. Meanwhile, atop a tall tower in the Grand and Capital, 2 elderly men stood side by side. One of them, with snow-white hair and a spirited demeanor, gazed at the flames rising from the Northern Duke's estate. A cold smirk curled at the corner of his lips as he spoke in a hoarse voice. "Second brother, are you satisfied now?" The other elder, who bore some resemblance to the first but appeared much younger, around 60 years old, responded fiercely to the question. "Elder brother, Richard Blake harmed my son and usurped my power. The fate he meets today is no less than what he deserves." "Humph. I'm sure Richard Blake never imagined that the head of the Dew family would turn out to be a cultivator of considerable standing." The older man sneered coldly. "Elder brother, the Blake family is backed by Virtue Keep. Acting so openly, do you think Virtue Keep will retaliate?" "Don't worry. The sect master's intention has always been to weaken Virtue Keep's influence in the mortal world. I've simply seized this opportunity to avenge my grandson." "Then that's good." Chapter 37, Handbook. Chase. Ethan Blake and his companions had just escaped through the back gate of the North Guard Duke's Manor, now engulfed in a sea of flames, when loud shouts echoed from behind. Immediately after, a wave of scorching heat surged toward them. Ethan Blake, fully aware of the imminent danger, grabbed Sophia Blake's hand, bent down, and rolled swiftly, landing several meters away. At the same time, he heard a blood-curdling scream. Looking back, he saw 4 maids trailing behind, their entire bodies ablaze. Their agonized cries pierced the air as they collapsed to the ground, writhing desperately to extinguish the flames. But these flames were no ordinary fire. The more they struggled, the fiercer the blaze grew. In mere moments, the 4 maids who had served Ethan Blake for 7 years, sharing a bond akin to siblings, had all perished. Trucy, Third Blake, narrowly escaping the flames, let out a heart-wrenching cry at the sight of his wife consumed by the inferno. Overcome with grief, he rushed toward Trucy, whose body was now almost entirely charred. Third Blake, don't go over there. Ethan Blake shouted urgently. Just as he was about to leap forward to intervene, a sharp glint of a sword suddenly shot out from the sea of flames, slicing Third Blake into 3 parts before he could reach her. Ethan Blake's eyes burned with fury at the horrifying scene, his rage boiling to its peak. Yet he knew that beyond the flames were cultivators of immense power, individuals who could end his life with just a flick of their fingers. Grinding his teeth, he roared, I don't care who you are or where you come from. This blood debt will be repaid. With that, he grabbed the terrified and dazed Sophia Blake and, with a few swift movements, fled into the distance. Swoosh, swoosh, swoosh. 3 figures emerged from the blazing inferno, young men wielding swords. They exchanged glances before leaping into pursuit. Ethan Blake, unsure of direction, ran with all his might, gradually distancing himself from the Northgard Duke's manor and blending into the bustling streets of the Grand and capital. In the sky above, hundreds of cultivators suddenly appeared. The Northgard Duke's manor was obliterated in an instant, reduced to an ocean of fire. This catastrophic event drew the attention of both officials and citizens throughout the Grand and capital. Half an hour later, numerous soldiers clad in armor rushed over, bringing water cannons with them in an attempt to extinguish the massive fire engulfing the Duke's mansion and prevent it from spreading to the surrounding structures. However, what astonished them was that no matter how intense the blaze grew, it remained confined within the boundaries of the mansion. The nearby buildings, even those separated by just a single wall, were completely unaffected. Immediately, someone speculated that the Northern Duke must have offended a sect from the immortal realm, which had led to this catastrophic disaster. The great fire raged for 3 days and 3 nights before gradually dying out. Yet, everyone within the mansion had turned to ashes, making it impossible to determine if there were any survivors. This incident sent shockwaves throughout the entire northern region, drawing widespread attention. After all, Richard Blake was a pillar of the Wu Kingdom. His sudden downfall would inevitably lead to subtle shifts in the dynamics among the 6 northern nations, with some countries even beginning preparations for small-scale wars. Both within and outside the Wu Kingdom, the political landscape grew turbulent, leaving those in power with splitting headaches. However, none of this was of concern to Ethan Blake. He had escaped the mansion with Sophia Blake, narrowly avoiding disaster, though they were far from safe. Since their departure, 3 shadowy figures had been relentlessly pursuing them like specters. Ethan couldn't discern their motives. Given their apparent cultivation level, taking his life would have been as easy as turning a hand. Yet, they didn't strike. They merely followed, leaving him constantly on edge. Ethan Blake, what should we do? Sophia Blake asked anxiously as they found themselves on a secluded path outside the grand capital, her gaze repeatedly darting nervously behind them. We'll head into the mountains first. As long as we find Snowy, we won't have to fear those 3 anymore. Ethan had already formulated a plan. Snowy was not only ferocious, but could also emit white light, which would be more than enough to handle ordinary cultivators. From his observations, the 3 pursuers didn't seem to possess high cultivation levels. With Snowy's help, there might even be a chance to eliminate them. Who is Snowy? Sophia asked urgently. You'll understand when you meet him. Ethan replied, unsure how to explain, quickening his pace even further. By now, for days had passed since the disaster at the Duke's mansion. During these 4 days, Ethan had been leading Sophia in a frantic escape through the grand capital, trying to shake off their pursuers. The grand capital, as the capital city of the Wu Kingdom, was vast beyond measure. The Duke's mansion alone occupied thousands of acres, giving a sense of just how enormous the city was. However, the sad truth is that no matter how much he tried to conceal his whereabouts, the enemy always managed to track him down. In the end, with no other choice, he he decided to leave the city to find Snowy. If these 3 pursuers were not eliminated, they would never be truly safe. Both of them appeared haggard, their clothes torn and disheveled, hair messy like dry grass. Anyone who saw them would never associate them with being a prince and princess in the royal household just days ago. This was my deliberate intention. Not to mention the 3 people tailing them. If anyone recognized their identities, it would surely lead to more assassination attempts. It's a simple truth. Those behind the massacre of the royal household would never let them go. The road they took was remote, but being close to the grand capital, occasional passers-by could still be seen. Upon noticing their appearance, most people kept their distance. However, a few kind-hearted souls tossed them some coins as an act of charity. He accepted them without hesitation. Having grown up begging, he was already accustomed to it. Even after living in the royal household for 7 years, he still retained this skill. The 2 of them walked continuously until they reached the small mountain where Snowy resided. Years ago, he had hidden Snowy here before heading to the Northern Duke's residence in the grand capital. 7 years had passed in the blink of an eye, during which he had only visited Snowy twice. This time, it had been 3 years since he last saw Snowy. He wasn't even sure where Snowy might be hiding on this small mountain. Though the mountain was small, it was still a mountain. Standing at its base and looking up, the dense forest appeared somewhat dark and foreboding. Ethan Blake surveyed the surroundings, but couldn't detect any sign of the 3 pursuers. He assumed they must have hidden themselves and remained vigilant. He found a narrow path leading up the mountain and ascended side by side with Sophia Blake. It was now early spring, and the flowers, grass, and trees had begun to awaken from the harsh winter, cloaking the area in a deep green hue. Some trees had even started sprouting fresh leaves, further aiding Ethan and Sophia in concealing their movements. Relying on his memory, Ethan located the cave where Snowy had lived 3 years ago. He found it empty, with no signs of recent animal activity, suggesting Snowy had likely found a better place to stay. They decided to spend the night in the cave, and continue their search for Snowy in other locations the following morning. The cave where Snowy resided was still vast, with a thick layer of dry grass spread across the ground, making it very comfortable to lie on. After traveling a long distance, both were exhausted. They took some food out of their packs, shared it, and ate in silence before sitting down on the dry grass, saying nothing. Having faced a major calamity, losing all her loved ones to the sea of flames, Sophia Blake was utterly devastated. However, what surprised Ethan Blake was that Sophia Blake did not shed a single tear. She merely bit her lip, her eyes reflecting a determined resolve. Her resilient nature was astonishingly similar to Ethan Blake's. "Ethan Blake, tell me, who exactly is this Snowy you've been searching for?" Sophia Blake suddenly broke the silence. Ethan Blake was momentarily stunned before replying, "Snowy isn't a person." He then recounted how he had been pursued, how Snowy had saved him, though he fabricated a different character to replace Miss Emma Watson in his story. After listening, Sophia Blake frowned slightly and, after a moment, said, "So that night you were taken away. At the time, I thought you had left without saying goodbye." "Huh?" Ethan Blake was taken aback and couldn't help but ask, "That night at Moonlight Hollow, didn't David Miller report to you? And what about Miss Emma Watson?" "I'm not sure either. That night, after we finished dinner, I went to bed with Sister Watson. The next morning, when I woke up, not only were you gone, but Sister Watson also left a letter saying Virtue Keep had urgently summoned her, and she left in the middle of the night," Sophia Blake explained. "I see," Ethan Blake murmured, recalling the events of that night at Moonlight Hollow. Some things were better left unknown to Sophia Blake. Sigh. The two exchanged a few words, then fell silent. After a while, Sophia Blake let out a soft sigh, as if trying to expel all the worries in her heart. "Princess Sophia, no one ever wishes for such things to happen," Ethan Blake said, not knowing how to comfort her. Deep down, his heart ached as well. Whether it was Richard Blake and his father, or Third Blake and the 4 handmaidens, they had all treated him well over the past 7 years. The sudden separation of life and death was truly hard to accept. However, having faced hardships since childhood, Ethan had developed a resolute mindset. He knew how to restrain himself, burying his pain deep within and refusing to let it show. At that moment, hearing the princess's sigh caused his heart to tremble slightly. He offered a few words of consolation, but said nothing further. Unexpectedly, Sophia Blake continued, "That day, my father summoned me early in the morning, saying he had something to instruct me on. I should have realized then that something was amiss." "Oh, what did his grace say to you?" Ethan Blake asked curiously. Sophia Blake shook her head and replied, "Father didn't say much. You know how he rarely speaks to us. But I remember that day he said, as long as a disciple of the Blake family can enter Virtue Keep and become an inner disciple, then no one in Wu Kingdom, or even the extreme north, will dare to touch us." Again. After pausing for a moment, Sophia Blake spoke again. "Father gave me this silk pouch, saying that if one day he was no longer by my side, I should open it. Perhaps it would provide some guidance." "What silk pouch? Why didn't you mention this earlier?" Ethan Blake scolded, silently speculating. Could it be that Richard Blake had foreseen the calamity that would befall the royal household? Yet as the pillar of a nation, even knowing disaster was imminent, he could not retreat. "This one right here." Sophia Blake reached into her chest, fumbling for a moment before finally pulling out a silk pouch about the size of her palm. She muttered, "We've been on the run these past 2 days, dodging here and there. How could I have had the chance to bring it up?" Ethan Blake didn't reach out to take it, instead saying, "Open it and see. Perhaps Father had some arrangements planned." Sophia Blake nodded, using the light streaming in from outside the cave to open the pouch. Out fell a longevity lock, which Ethan Blake immediately snatched up. "This is my longevity lock," Ethan Blake exclaimed, a strange sense of foreboding rising within him. The silk pouch left behind by the Northern Guardian Duke, Richard Blake, must hold secrets tied to him. Chapter 38, 3 People. Ethan Blake held the longevity locket in his hand, his heart pounding as he guessed that the silk pouch of Duke Richard Blake might contain secrets related to him. Sophia Blake froze, then carefully took out a neatly folded white paper from the silk pouch. Slowly unfolding it, she read softly, "The calamity upon the Duke's residence is unavoidable. Rest assured, my daughter, your father has long made arrangements. Take this pouch to Virtue Keep, and there will naturally be someone to care for you. Furthermore, tell Ethan that if he wishes to uncover his origins, he must seek out a man named Wan Wu." "Is that all?" Ethan Blake furrowed his brows. Sophia Blake nodded, her expression softening as she said, "Ethan Blake, doesn't this mean that Father has already prepared everything, and that they've likely escaped this disaster?" "Perhaps. The Duke is a far-sighted man. He may have planned ahead, and by now, they might already be out of danger." Ethan Blake's eyes gleamed. Since childhood, he had only known Margaret Snow as his biological mother, but he had never known who his father was. As a child, it didn't matter much, but as he grew older, this question became a lingering concern. At times, he even doubted whether Richard Blake was his real father, though he never had the courage to ask. And now, in Richard Blake's letter, it was mentioned that by finding someone named Wan Wu, the truth about his origins would be revealed. Shaking his head to dispel the wandering thoughts in his mind, he said, "Since the Duke instructed us to go to Virtue Keep, there must be a reason. Once we've dealt with the current troubles, we'll head there." "All right. I'll leave everything to you. Sophia Blake carefully stored the letter and the silk pouch, glancing at the longevity locket in Ethan Blake's hand, as if wanting to say something but hesitating. Ethan Blake smiled and put the locket away. This was left to me by my mother. I suppose the Duke's intention was to return it to me. Unknowingly, night had fallen. A cold wind swept through the mountain, and darkness enveloped the cave. Sophia Blake was leaning against Ethan Blake, softly snoring as she drifted into sleep. From Richard Blake's silk pouch, it became clear that her father and the others had long been prepared. Sophia's tense nerves immediately relaxed, and the overwhelming fatigue took hold, causing her to doze off. Ethan Blake, however, felt no trace of sleepiness. While the northern frontier king may have escaped his ill fate, the danger looming over him and Sophia Blake remained unresolved. The three shadowy figures trailing them, what was their true purpose? It was still a mystery. Perhaps their journey of fleeing had only just begun. In the middle of the night, as Ethan Blake leaned against the cave wall, lost in thought, he suddenly heard faint footsteps outside. He quickly sat upright, his gaze sharp and fixed on the cave entrance. This mountain cave was exceptionally secluded, its entrance concealed by thick bushes. From where he sat, he could only see the trees swaying in the wind, casting eerie shadows that sent chills down his spine. Could it be those three? Are they planning to strike here? Ethan Blake immediately grew wary, a foreboding feeling rising within him. At the same time, he blamed his own lack of experience. What if the three were deliberately seeking an isolated spot to attack them? If that were the case, there could only be one explanation. The trio wanted to ensure no one else knew that someone from the royal household had survived. And this survivor must be carrying something they desperately desired. Could it be they know my identity? Ethan Blake thought carefully, cold sweat breaking out all over his body. He suddenly remembered a crucial detail. The jade pendant belonging to Charles Green was still in his possession. If their target was indeed the jade pendant, then danger could strike at any moment. Rustle, rustle, rustle. The footsteps grew closer, and in the blink of an eye, they were at the cave entrance. A cold voice rang out. Strange, the boy's presence seems to vanish here. Another voice followed. Senior brother Matthew Gray, we've tracked him for so long. Are you certain this boy is the one who obtained the jade pendant all those years ago? Humph, are you doubting my judgment? While he has grown up, his features still bear some resemblance to when he was a child. Moreover, don't you recognize it? His movement technique originates from Ethereal Hall, I'm certain of it. That brat is Ethan Blake. All these years, he's been completely off the grid, and it turns out he's been hiding in the Northern Duke's residence. No wonder, despite all our efforts, we couldn't track him down, Senior Brother Matthew Gray said. All right then. Junior Brother Brian, release your spiritual sense and see if you can detect Ethan Blake's aura. Heh. In the Grand Capital, we have to be cautious about making a move for fear of other sect members interfering. But here, in the desolate mountain range, there's no need to hold back. Kill him, take the jade pendant, and the three of us will rise through the ranks rapidly. Understood, a deep voice replied. At this moment, Ethan Blake was extremely tense. The current situation was eerily similar to the time he was in Snowy's cave years ago. Unfortunately, this time, it seemed unlikely that another coincidence would save him. Ethan Blake, are you? Unexpectedly, Sophia Blake woke up at that moment, mumbling softly. Before she could finish her sentence, Ethan Blake quickly covered her mouth and gestured for her to stay silent. Sophia Blake blinked her large eyes in confusion, nodding blankly, unsure of what was happening. Just then, the cave suddenly lit up as three young men, holding torches, walked in side by side. Leading the group was a young man with a scar on his face. He glanced coldly at Ethan Blake and Sophia Blake, who were sitting on the dry grass, and sneered. "Not bad. This is quite a fitting place to meet your end." Hearing the voice, Ethan Blake immediately deduced that this man must be senior brother Matthew Gray. Ethan Blake slowly stood up, stretching his slightly stiff limbs. With an indifferent expression he asked, "You've been following us all this way. What exactly do you want?" "Heh heh. Ethan Blake, don't act clueless. We won't waste words with you. Hand over the jade pendant, and we'll grant you a quick death." The young man standing to Matthew Gray's left said menacingly, "What is this jade pendant?" Ethan Blake feigned confusion, though 7 years ago he had faced masters like Henry Brooks alone without flinching. Compared to that, the three before him were mere small fry. "Stop pretending," senior brother Matthew Gray said impatiently. "This is the wild mountain range, desolate and uninhabited. No one will come to help you. Moreover, with the skills of the three of us, you have no chance of escape. Hand over the jade pendant obediently, and sparing your life might still be an option. Your arrogance knows no bounds," Ethan Blake replied, stalling for time while his mind raced to devise a strategy. At this moment, whether he handed over the absolute jade or not, death seemed inevitable. Besides, the absolute jade was something he couldn't extract from his body on his own. "Is death truly the only path left?" Ethan Blake thought to himself. On the side, Sophia Blake's head spun as she listened. She had never heard of the absolute jade before, but seeing Ethan Blake's grim expression and the aggressiveness of their opponents, she realized the situation was dire. Her eyes darted around as a plan formed in her mind, and she shouted, "Hey! Don't push us too far. Do you even know why we came to this mountain? Let me tell you, though the Northern Duke's household has fallen, we still have ties with Virtue Keep. I am here under my father's orders, waiting for Virtue Keep's people to meet us. They should be arriving any moment now." As soon as Sophia Blake finished speaking, the three men were stunned. Moments later, the previously silent young man sneered. "Stop trying to scare us with Virtue Keep. The Northern Duke died by our hands. Do you really think Virtue Keep cares about insignificant brats like you? Believe it or not, it's up to you," Sophia Blake said calmly, her expression unwavering. "I'm just warning you, if we die, and Virtue Keep's people arrive, you'll end up with nothing but regret. You'll gain nothing in the end." Ethan Blake was secretly astonished, not expecting Sophia Blake to be so adept at fabricating stories. Judging by the hesitant expressions of their opponents, it was clear they had begun to believe her, at least partially. Matthew Gray, the leader of the group, wore a conflicted expression as he hesitated, weighing whether to kill Ethan Blake and Sophia Blake now to seize the treasure. As he deliberated, Ethan Blake spoke up. "Do you know why so many people hunted me down back then, and still failed to obtain the absolute jade?" As soon as he finished speaking, the attention of the three men was immediately drawn to him. "To be honest with you all, the absolute jade has been hidden inside my body by Charles Green. Once I die, this jade will disappear along with me. This is the very reason why, back then, even someone as formidable as Henry Brooks couldn't do anything to me," Ethan Blake said, casting a glance at Sophia Blake. The two exchanged a look of mutual understanding. "Humph, utter nonsense!" Senior brother Matthew Gray shouted loudly, as if trying to dispel the doubts lingering in his heart. "Don't believe me? Listen, what's that sound outside?" At that moment, a deafening roar echoed from outside the cave. Hearing it, Ethan Blake's heart leaped with joy. It was a sound he knew all too well. It was Snelly's roar. Seizing the moment, he mustered all his strength and shouted loudly. Immediately, the expressions of the three people changed, and they couldn't help but turn their heads to look outside the cave. "A great opportunity," Ethan Blake thought to himself, his body suddenly lunging forward like lightning toward senior brother Matthew Gray. At the same time, A cold gleam flashed in his hand, a blade slashing straight toward Matthew Gray. Ethan Blake, having reached the tiger's subduing realm, possessed strength and speed far beyond that of ordinary people. However, compared to a true cultivator, there was still a vast difference. Fully aware of the disparity between them, Ethan poured every ounce of his strength into this strike, his momentum as fierce as thunder. The trio led by Matthew Gray, in truth, were insignificant figures within their sect. Matthew Gray, however, stood out due to his remarkable memory and cunning, often taking the lead among the three. It's often said that stepping onto the path of cultivation unlocks extraordinary intelligence. In reality, this isn't entirely true. Only upon reaching a certain realm does one achieve such miraculous effects. Ordinary cultivators aren't significantly more intelligent than regular people. In fact, some cultivators are even less clever than the average person. Luck plays a considerable role in one's ability to become a cultivator. The three led by Matthew Gray were precisely such individuals. Yet, they always considered themselves clever and refused to remain mediocre cultivators, constantly seeking opportunities. Encountering Ethan Blake was evidently one of those opportunities for them. However, at this very moment, that opportunity was threatening his life. Senior brother Matthew Gray instinctively sensed an intense murderous aura rushing toward him. Startled, the torch in his hand trembled as he hurriedly defended himself. But unexpectedly, Ethan Blake's target was not him at all. Seeing his opponent raise the torch to block, Ethan Blake swiftly changed his move, redirecting his attack toward another person besides senior brother Matthew Gray. However, a cultivator is still a cultivator. How could Ethan Blake succeed so easily? The person simply waved their sleeve, releasing a surge of energy that completely ignored Ethan Blake's assault, forcing him to retreat. Chapter 39. Lost. Ethan Blake only felt a powerful force surging toward him, pushing him backward, leaving him inwardly astonished. At this moment, he possessed the strength of the tiger's subduing fist, his muscles, bones, and flesh tempered to be as tough as steel, his power even more extraordinary. Yet, the opponent merely waved a sleeve lightly and forced him back. This demonstrated that even the lowest-ranked cultivator was terrifyingly formidable. It's often said that ignorance breeds fearlessness. Previously, Ethan Blake was entirely clueless about the cultivation of the immortal path. No matter how powerful a cultivator stood before him, they all seemed the same to him. But now, it was different. Having just stepped into the threshold of cultivation, he had gained some understanding of the realms within the immortal path. The more he understood, the more he grasped the vast differences between cultivators. As he was overwhelmed with shock, the young man moved. Without any noticeable action, a treasured sword appeared in his hand, emanating a chilling murderous aura. With a slight flick of the wrist, the sword's light flickered like a serpent's tongue, emitting cold flashes that thrust straight toward Ethan Blake. Ethan Blake felt an icy killing intent engulf him, his entire body seemingly bound, suddenly becoming sluggish. When he was ambushed in the western Cloud Mountain, the cultivator named Darren Paul had struck at him with a palm, evoking the same sensation he felt now. Ethan Blake didn't know that this was what cultivators called pressure. Just the sheer presence of it was enough to suppress an opponent into immobility. Sophia Blake stood nearby, her heart filled with worry, as she saw Ethan Blake frozen in place, unable to dodge. She couldn't help but shout loudly, "Don't hurt Ethan Blake!" Without a thought for her own safety, she rushed toward the gleaming sword light aimed at Ethan Blake. Sophia's shout jolted Ethan Blake back to his senses. He immediately became more agile, and the immense pressure emanating from his opponent seemed to diminish significantly. "Sophia, get out of the way!" Ethan Blake bellowed. Grabbing Sophia Blake by the waist, he threw her aside with force, simultaneously dodging to the side. However, His opponent's movements were too swift, leaving no time to evade. With a sickening thud, the sword light pierced through Ethan Blake's shoulder, causing fresh blood to spurt out. Under the flickering flames, the crimson hue appeared even more vivid. Everything happened in an instant, too fast for anyone to react. Struck by the blade, Ethan Blake was sent flying by the impact, slamming heavily against the rocky wall of the cave. Meanwhile, Sophia Blake, thrown aside by Ethan Blake, landed on a pile of dry grass, her head spinning. Fortunately, neither of them was in mortal danger. But the young man seemed unsatisfied. He raised his sword again and charged toward Ethan Blake, clearly intent on taking his life. Dodging the first attack had already pushed Ethan Blake to his limits. Seeing his opponent advancing once more, he couldn't help but cry out internally, "Brother Reed, why aren't you here yet?" As if guided by fate, just as Ethan Blake's mind wandered, desperately hoping for Brother Reed's assistance, a beam of white light, as wide as a bowl, suddenly shot in from outside the cave. The radiant white light silently struck the young man, who was attacking Ethan Blake. Slash! The young man, mid-strike, froze abruptly, his body trembling. His face filled with disbelief. He slowly turned around and stammered, "Senior Brother Matthew Gray, what is this?" Before he could finish his sentence, a mist of blood erupted. His body, from the waist down, was severed by the white light. "Junior Brother!" The two remaining young cultivators exclaimed in shock, immediately turning their gazes toward the cave entrance. There stood a massive ferocious beast blocking the entrance, its blood-red eyes fixed intently on the two of them. The two young cultivators were none other than Senior Brother Matthew Gray and Junior Brother Brian, whose names Ethan Blake had overheard earlier. Seeing the sudden appearance of the colossal beast at the cave entrance, both men were utterly terrified, instinctively taking a step back. However, they quickly stopped, as Ethan Blake was lurking behind them. "Heh heh. Snowy, you're really late," Ethan Blake said softly. "Roar!" Snowy let out a deep growl, its gaze never leaving Gray and Brian. Senior Brother Matthew Gray's face darkened as his eyes darted around. Suddenly, he sneered and dashed towards Sophia Blake, who was lying on the ground. Although Sophia Blake often trained alongside Ethan Blake, her efforts were inconsistent. 3 days of practice followed by 2 days of idleness. Her strength was lacking, and she felt a deep unease. Unable to evade, she was swiftly captured by Senior Brother Matthew Gray. "Heh heh, what a surprise. You actually have a spirit beast aiding you." Senior Brother Matthew Gray sneered coldly, glaring at Ethan Blake. "Kid, order your spirit beast to back off and let me leave. Otherwise, I'll risk it all and kill this girl. Shameless." Ethan Blake's eyes turned red with anger upon seeing Sophia Blake captured. He cursed before saying, "What skill is there in capturing a lady? I can order Snowy to let you out, but you must leave Sophia behind for me." "Humph. Do you think we would believe you? Stop spouting nonsense. I'll count to 3. If you don't move aside, I'll kill her." Senior Brother Matthew Gray spoke viciously, signaling with his eyes to Junior Brother Brian. Brian immediately drew his sword, pressing its tip against Sophia Blake's chest. A slight push would end her life. 1. Senior Brother Matthew Gray wasted no time, beginning to count. "Wait! I'll be your hostage. Let her go," Ethan Blake decisively shouted. "Don't forget, only I know the whereabouts of the absolute jade." Matthew Gray's expression softened instantly. After a brief moment of thought, he said, "Fine. Come here yourself." Without hesitation, Ethan Blake stepped forward, saying, "You'd better not try anything. My spirit beast only listens to me. If something goes wrong, none of you will escape." "Humph," Matthew Gray snorted coldly. Initially, he had intended to capture both Ethan and Sophia, but hearing Ethan's warning, he abandoned that idea. Although Gray and Brian's cultivation levels were not high, they were still practitioners, far more skilled than Ethan Blake. They weren't too concerned about him pulling any tricks. As Ethan approached, Brian pressed his sword against Ethan's body, adding, "If you don't want this little lady to die, don't try anything funny." Ethan ignored him and turned to Sophia Blake, whose terrified eyes were wide open. He said, "Sophia, let Snowy take you away first. I'll follow after." Ethan Blake. Sophia Blake, being intelligent, understood Ethan's intentions. She softly called his name, tears streaming down her face. "Now! Release her!" Ethan Blake glared at Matthew Gray. Matthew Gray hesitated for a moment, his gaze flickering toward the massive white bear blocking the cave entrance. In the end, he feared Ethan might truly risk everything, leading to mutual destruction, which would benefit no one. Finally, he pushed Sophia Blake forward without a word, stepping in front of Ethan Blake with a cold glint flashing in his eyes. "Snowy, her name is Sophia Blake. You must ensure her safety without any mistakes. I'll come to find you later," Ethan Blake said loudly. Snowy let out a soft groan, decisively embraced Sophia Blake, and turned to leave. Ethan Blake. Sophia Blake felt a sharp pain in her heart. Although Ethan Blake didn't give her any specific instructions, she understood his intentions clearly. To ensure her escape from danger, Ethan Blake didn't hesitate to use himself as a bargaining chip. If she refused to leave, his efforts would be in vain. "Ethan Blake, I know you'll be fine." As Snowy carried Sophia Blake away at high speed, she mumbled softly. Suddenly, a warm droplet landed on her cheek. Curious, she looked up and noticed the red light in Snowy's eyes had vanished, replaced by a faint shimmer of tears. She couldn't help but think, "This spirit beast, it's truly so empathetic." Watching Snowy take Sophia Blake away, Ethan Blake breathed a sigh of relief. Gray and Brian were cultivators, far beyond his ability to contend with. With Sophia Blake present, she would always be a hostage in their hands. Now that Snowy had taken Sophia Blake away, Ethan Blake was alone, giving him the chance to stall and look for an opportunity to escape. After all, the enemy hadn't killed him yet. They merely wanted the jade pendant he possessed. With this leverage, his life was temporarily safe. "Hey, put your swords away! You're both cultivators. Are you really afraid I'll run away?" Ethan Blake pushed aside the sword Brian had pressed against his chest and glanced at the wound on his shoulder. "Don't you have any healing elixirs? I've lost so much blood. If I pass out and forget everything, wouldn't you be wasting your time?" "Humph." Matthew Gray snorted coldly, pulling out a small cloth pouch. After rummaging through it, he took out several bottles and jars. Finally, he grabbed a small vial and tossed it to Brian. "Junior brother Brian, treat this brat's wound. Our future ascension depends entirely on him." When Ethan Blake saw the small cloth pouch, his eyes lit up. He remembered it was called a storage pouch, something he had seen once as a child with Selena. "Hey, just wait until I find the right moment. I'll kill them all and take that storage pouch," Ethan Blake thought to himself. But he quickly sighed, knowing that these cultivators were far beyond what someone at his level, the tiger subduing realm, could handle. Unaware of Ethan Blake's thoughts, the two cultivators saw the gleam in his eyes, and assumed he was awestruck by the pouch's magical properties. Both of them smirked arrogantly. Junior brother Brian took the medicine bottle, tore a piece of cloth from Ethan Blake's sleeve, and bandaged his wound, saying, "Senior brother Matthew Gray, what should we do about Senior brother Way's body?" Senior brother Matthew Gray furrowed his brows, pondered for a moment, and then said, "Senior brother Way was pursuing the remnants of the Blake family, and unfortunately met his demise, leaving no remains. As fellow disciples, I am deeply grieved." After speaking, He took a talisman out of a small cloth pouch and tossed it onto Senior Brother Wei's corpse. Sizzle. In an instant, a light smoke rose from the body, and in just a moment, the entire corpse was reduced to ashes, leaving only a faint trace on the ground. Ethan Blake's expression subtly changed upon witnessing this, silently cursing the other for being so ruthless, showing no mercy even to his fellow disciple. "Humph. Do you see that? Cooperate properly, or I'll stick this talisman on you, making you endure the agony of being corroded alive." Matthew Gray sneered coldly, his face full of cruelty. Chapter 40. Fairy Part 1. "Kid, stop dawdling and move faster. Damn it. Bringing along a useless guy like you forces us to walk on foot." On a wide, spacious road, 3 people slowly made their way forward. By now, they were thousands of miles away from the grand capital. Along the vast road, horse-drawn carriages occasionally sped past, and many curious onlookers cast glances at the 3 travelers. Toby Bryan grew irritated, giving Ethan Blake a shove while scolding him. Ethan Blake, however, remained the same, unhurried and lazy in demeanor. It had been over 3 months since he was captured on a small mountain outside the grand capital. During this time, Ethan Blake had sparred verbally with Gray and Bryan, eventually concocting a lie. He claimed that years ago, Charles Green had not placed the jade jewel on him, but had merely told him where it was hidden. At first, Gray and Bryan didn't believe him. But after reconsidering, they began to trust him somewhat. Years ago, when the 3 great sects sent countless experts to hunt Ethan Blake, they had found nothing. It turned out the jade jewel was never on him in the first place, making capturing him pointless. According to Ethan Blake, the jade jewel was hidden in the far northern reaches of the Arctic lands, specifically in a Taoist temple in the Yunshui Kingdom. As for the name of the temple, Ethan Blake stubbornly refused to reveal it. He only said he was willing to lead them there, and demanded a share of the benefits once they obtained the treasure. Thus, they had no choice but to believe Ethan Blake and follow his directions, leaving the Grand Capital's territory and heading northward. Ethan Blake had also learned the names of his 2 captors. The senior disciple was named Matthew Gray, while the other was Toby Bryan. However, he couldn't figure out which sect they belonged to. The 2 men were extremely cautious when speaking, never revealing their origins. Ethan Blake could only accept this lack of information. Additionally, on the way, Ethan Blake racked his brain, trying to figure out a way to escape. The location of the absolute jade he mentioned was, of course, fake. Once they arrived, his lie would naturally be exposed. However, the 2 men were extremely cautious, leaving him no opportunity. In the end, Ethan resorted to dragging his feet along the road, attempting to delay as much time as possible. "You 2 are strong and robust, so naturally, you're not tired. But I'm exhausted. I was injured just a few days ago, lost a lot of blood. How could I possibly move quickly?" Ethan Blake complained irritably. After all, they wouldn't harm him before reaching the destination, so he felt no need to mince his words. Matthew Gray merely snorted coldly and continued walking. Ethan Blake, with his endless tricks and schemes along the way, had worn down his patience. He decided to remain silent, thinking to himself that once they obtained the absolute jade, he would chop this brat into 100 pieces. Toby Bryan, though gruff in speech, had a fiery temper. Hearing Ethan Blake's complaints, he immediately grew enraged and shouted, "That injury was 3 months ago, damn it! You've long since healed. Stop using it as an excuse. Are you tired of living?" Ethan Blake showed no sign of backing down. "Then kill me already. Listening to your nagging all day is driving me insane. Damn it, I'm tired, and I want to rest." With that, he walked straight to the roadside, plopped down onto the ground, and staged a scene. "If you keep pulling stunts like this, I swear I'll teach you a lesson. Toby Bryan, now even angrier, stormed over, grabbed Ethan Blake by the collar, and lifted him up, ready to strike. You two pitiless fools, traveling thousands of miles to Cloudwater Nation without even renting a carriage. Do you think I'm some kind of immortal? Oh, that's right, aren't you cultivators? Just fly me there or something. Either way, I can't walk anymore. Kill me or don't, it's up to you. Ethan Blake shouted loudly. Toby Bryan's face darkened. His raised hand swung toward Ethan Blake's face. While killing him wasn't an option, giving him a few slaps was fair game. Smack! A slap landed, immediately swelling Ethan Blake's cheek. Toby Bryan's strength was truly no joke. Ouch! I'm fainting. I can't remember anything anymore, Ethan Blake exclaimed dramatically. He then closed his eyes, pretending to pass out. Don't play dead with me. Toby Bryan, fully aware of Ethan Blake's act, cursed angrily, raising his hand to strike again. All right, junior brother Bryan, let's get moving and stop making a fuss, Matthew Gray said coldly. He then patted Ethan Blake on the shoulder and added, You'd better stop causing trouble. Once we reach Jade Peak, there will be plenty of benefits for you. But if you keep stirring up chaos, we brothers would rather forego Jade Peak altogether and kill you to vent our anger. Heh heh. Would you really give up the benefits that Jade Peak offers you? Ethan Blake opened his eyes, brushed Toby Bryan's hand aside, and mocked. Fine, let's keep moving. Once we reach the next town, I'll hire a carriage, Matthew Gray said, unwilling to argue further with Ethan Blake, and walked ahead. Hurry up, Toby Bryan urged, giving Ethan Blake a push. Reluctantly, Ethan had no choice but to continue heading north. He remained curious. These two cultivators were clearly among the many who flew on swords across the sky on the day the royal manor was annihilated. Why didn't they take him along? What he didn't know was that unless one's cultivation reached a certain level, it was simply impossible to carry someone while flying. The cultivation levels of Matthew Gray and Toby Bryan were still far from that threshold. However, compared to Ethan Blake's tiger-subduing realm, their strength was vastly superior. In the world of cultivation, even a single level difference could result in an enormous disparity in power, with the strong and weak clearly defined. Ethan Blake caused chaos on the road like this, not just once or twice. After calming down, he could only continue his journey. A few days later, the three of them arrived at a small town called Sa Long Town. About 2,000 miles away from Sa Long Town lies the border of the Yuan-Shui Kingdom. It is said that many years ago, from the desperate desert in the western barbarian lands, a celestial dragon flew out, wreaking havoc from west to north, slaughtering countless living beings along its path, enraging the spiritual cultivators. As a result, they united their forces and, at the current location of Sa Long Town, managed to slay the celestial dragon. The celestial dragon possessed profound magical powers, being a spiritual beast that had attained immortal arts, ferocious beyond measure. It took the lives of over 1,000 spiritual cultivators before it was finally defeated. As the celestial dragon was about to die, it unleashed a heavenly flame in a desperate attempt to retaliate. However, this heavenly flame was struck down by a great cultivator of that time with a single sword strike, neutralizing its power. The residual force left 2 long scorched marks on the ground stretching for hundreds of miles. Over time, these scorched marks began to gradually desertify the surrounding area, significantly altering the original terrain, turning it into an exceptionally rare small desert. This small desert spans less than 100 miles. Regardless of spring, summer, autumn, or winter, it neither rains nor snows, making it a natural wonder. Sa Long Town is located on the edge of this small desert, and its name originates from the term dragon slaying. Although Sa Long Town is not a major town, it is still bustling and lively, with a steady flow of people passing through. The three arrived at Saw Long Town, ate their fill, and Matthew Gray immediately instructed Toby Bryan to rent a carriage, clearly with no intention of staying. Ethan Blake felt a growing unease. Once they had a carriage, their travel speed would greatly increase, and his lies would inevitably be exposed. At that point, his fate would hang by a thread. He needed to find a way to escape before reaching their destination. Thinking of fleeing, Ethan Blake glanced at Matthew Gray and sighed inwardly. Over the past 3 months, Matthew Gray had never let his guard down, leaving no opportunity for escape. Sigh. I must come up with a plan to get Matthew Gray out of the way. As for Toby Bryan, he'll be easier to deal with, Ethan Blake thought, frowning. Suddenly, he noticed Matthew Gray in front of him shiver slightly, as if sensing something, and began scanning their surroundings. At that moment, they were in a bustling tavern, surrounded by patrons clinking glasses, chatting noisily, and enjoying their meals. Curious, Ethan Blake followed Matthew Gray's gaze. He spotted, several tables away in a shadowy corner, a woman wearing a wide-brimmed conical hat, staring in their direction. The hat obscured her entire face, but her figure revealed her to be a woman. Matthew Gray frowned and withdrew his gaze, deep in thought, though his expression betrayed nothing. Ethan Blake, however, couldn't resist taking another look. The woman nodded slightly at him, which only deepened his curiosity. Who was she? Did she know him? Was she an ally or an enemy? Just then, Toby Bryan returned, leaned close to Matthew Gray, and whispered a few words. He then shot a glare at Ethan Blake and said, As you wished, we've rented a carriage. Let's see if you still dare harbor any foul intentions. Ethan Blake snorted and ignored him. All right, Toby Bryan, go find the shopkeeper and buy some dry rations. We'll continue on our way, Matthew Gray said. Yes, senior brother. Sigh, it's a pity we haven't reached that level yet. Otherwise, we wouldn't need to eat this mundane food, Toby Bryan muttered as he walked away. Such a chatterbox, Matthew Gray muttered under his breath, grabbing Ethan Blake's arm. Let's go! The three of them boarded the carriage and left Saw Long Town, speeding northward. Lifting the curtain, they could see the small desert stretching out before them. The undulating sand dunes resembled waves, evoking an endless, boundless feeling. It was as if stepping into it meant never being able to find a way out. The environment here was peculiar. On one side was a sea of sand, while on the other, grass taller than a person swayed gently in the wind, interspersed with a few strange ancient trees. One side was a desert, the other a grassland, both capable of disorienting the eyes. Staring too long made one feel inexplicably uneasy. Ethan Blake let the curtain fall back down, calculating in his mind. If he were to suddenly jump off the carriage and flee at this moment, how likely would he succeed? But he quickly shook his head, dismissing the idea of escaping here. The area was too open. If Matthew Gray and Toby Bryan took flight on their swords, his movements would be entirely exposed, leaving no chance to escape. I wonder if the Yuan Shui Kingdom has any mountain ranges. To evade the pursuit of cultivators, the deep mountains would be the best refuge. Even those two wouldn't have the ability to move mountains and drain seas, Ethan Blake thought to himself. Shui shui. At this moment, the carriage shook violently as the 4 mules pulling it neighed loudly, seemingly terrified by something. Junior brother Bryan, go outside and check. Matthew Gray remained seated, issuing the command calmly. Toby Bryan's figure flickered as he leaped out of the carriage, shouting loudly, Who's the fool blocking my way, ah? The two inside the carriage were stunned. Toby Bryan had barely stepped out, and before he could finish his sentence, a tragic scream rang out, followed by silence. Matthew Gray's face changed repeatedly. He leaned toward the carriage door, unsheathing his sword, and lifted a corner of the curtain to look outside. What he saw was a woman wearing a wide-brimmed conical hat standing in front of the carriage. At her feet lay the decapitated body of Toby Bryan. Ethan Blake also peeked through the raised curtain, taking in the scene outside. The woman was indeed the same one they had seen earlier in the tavern. She nodded slightly in his direction. The woman, dressed in white, had a slender waist and a graceful figure, so delicate that it seemed a mere breeze could topple her. What a petite waist! I wonder what her face looks like. Ethan Blake, though not a lecherous man, couldn't help but feel intrigued as he silently speculated about her appearance. Matthew Gray hesitated for a moment before lifting the curtain and jumping out of the carriage. Trying to maintain his composure, he asked, "May I ask why you blocked our path and killed my junior brother?" "Too much talking." To his utter shock, the woman uttered just 4 words before raising her hand. A flash of light streaked through the air. Before Matthew Gray could even grunt, his head flew off, spinning several times in the air before landing on the ground. Blood spurted high from his neck. Inside the carriage, Ethan Blake collapsed in fear. He had witnessed killings before, but never one executed so swiftly and decisively, without a single wasted word. What terrified him even more was that, after killing Matthew Gray with a single move, the woman's slender figure swayed slightly, as she floated off the ground. She landed silently on the carriage shaft and spoke. "Hey! You're the only one left!" Chapter 41. Fairy Part 2. Ethan Blake only felt the wind howling past his ears, his body swaying like a pendulum, rocking and floating as if drifting among the clouds. A sudden emptiness surged in his heart, and he didn't even dare to open his eyes. He could only twist and ride his body incessantly, attempting to escape this sensation. "Stay still, or I'll throw you down." As he struggled, a woman's voice suddenly rang in his ears. It was sweet and alluring, a tone that stirred the heart and made it difficult to resist. His heart itched uncontrollably, as if something intangible was teasing him, leaving him unable to grasp or scratch it. He could only wish he could grab the owner of that voice and take his frustration out on her. "I don't need you to throw me down. I'm about to fall on my own." Although her voice was pleasant to hear, the thought of his current predicament filled him with both fear and anger, causing him to shout loudly. "You still dare to argue? Fine." Suddenly, Ethan Blake felt his body go weightless, and then he plummeted straight down. Terrified, he instinctively opened his eyes and let out a startled scream. At that moment, he found himself high in the sky, surrounded by fluffy white clouds that quickly receded as he hurtled toward the ground. "Help! Help! Cough, cough, cough!" Ethan Blake mustered all his strength to cry out, but after only a couple of shouts, the fierce wind rushed into his mouth, rendering him unable to make a sound. The scenery on the ground became clearer and clearer. He was about to crash, and the outcome was all too predictable. In just a few breaths, he would undoubtedly be smashed into a pulp. Whoosh! Suddenly, a figure darted toward him from the side. A hand grabbed his waist and pulled him upward, halting his fall and lifting him back into the air. "How about now? If you dare defy me again, I'll really let you fall and turn into a pile of mincemeat." That sweet, melodious voice sounded once more. Ethan Blake was unusually obedient this time, squinting at the person gripping his waist, not daring to utter another word. Just an hour earlier, Ethan Blake had been transported northward in a horse-drawn carriage by his 2 companions, Matthew Gray and Toby Bryan, their destination being some unknown location in the Van Shui Kingdom. However, their journey was abruptly interrupted by a mysterious woman, her head covered by a wide-brimmed hat, her slender waist seemingly untouchable. Without saying a word, she swiftly decapitated both Matthew Gray and Toby Bryan. She then dragged Ethan Blake out of the carriage, looted all the belongings of the 2 brothers, and carried him away. This mysterious woman was truly formidable. With one hand holding Ethan Blake, she bypassed main roads entirely, leaping through the air. Across a sea of grass taller than a person, she treaded lightly, as if walking on the grass itself. In one breath, she covered over 100 miles, finally stopping in a desolate area. Ethan Blake was terrified, unsure of her intentions. Just as he was about to speak, she raised her hand and slapped him, cutting off his question mid-sentence. Afterward, the mysterious woman looked up at the sky without a word, pulling out an object resembling a willow leaf and tossing it into the air. The object expanded rapidly upon catching the wind, transforming in an instant into a massive structure several meters long, floating midair. Grabbing Ethan Blake, the woman leapt onto the object. Before he could steady himself, the structure shot up into the sky like an arrow, heading toward the heavens. Frightened, Ethan Blake quickly shut his eyes and attempted to struggle free, only to end up in the same predicament as before. "Hey, why are you staring at me?" the mysterious woman snapped, noticing Ethan Blake's gaze. "Dear immortal sister, could you kindly tell me what you intend to do with me?" Ethan Blake cautiously asked, trying to steady himself, fearing another slap might come his way. Although the woman's slender waist made her appear fragile, her strength was astonishing, and he truly could not endure another blow. Fortunately, the mysterious woman did not make a move this time. Instead, she released her grip on Ethan Blake's belt and said, "Sit tight. If you fall off the divine vessel, I'll have no choice but to find someone else." Ethan Blake quickly nodded, not daring to struggle. He slowly sat down, glancing around with a hint of unease. All around the divine vessel, there was nothing but clouds and mist in countless shapes and forms. Upon closer inspection, they were incredibly beautiful. In the distance, a vast sea of clouds stretched endlessly, resembling a celestial paradise. A sense of calm suddenly settled in his heart as he thought, "The skies above are truly this breathtaking. Just now, I was so afraid that I almost missed this magnificent view. I need you to go somewhere for me." Just as Ethan Blake regained his composure and began to marvel at the wondrous sensation of being high above, the woman reached up to remove her wide-brimmed hat and spoke slowly. "So beautiful." Ethan Blake's gaze was instantly drawn back to her. This mysterious woman not only had a strangely captivating voice, but also a beauty that could topple kingdoms. With just a frown or a smile, she dimmed the brilliance of 100 flowers. Her every gesture and movement seemed to overshadow even the wind and clouds. "Humph!" The mysterious woman, noticing Ethan Blake staring at her in a daze, let out a cold snort. She slightly furrowed her brows, and a frosty layer appeared on her jade-like face. Even when angry, she's this beautiful," Ethan Blake muttered absent-mindedly. Admiring beauty is natural. In the face of such a stunning woman, compliments naturally flowed from his heart. Slap! A sharp sound echoed as Ethan Blake's cheek instantly turned red and swollen. "Stop staring," the mysterious woman said coldly, as if warning him that if he dared show any hint of lust again, she would toss him off the divine vessel. Holding his cheek, Ethan Blake felt a surge of anger. Though this woman was stunning, her actions were ruthless and her words carried the tone of someone owed a great debt. Her temperament and appearance truly stood on opposite ends of the spectrum. "Fine, I won't look. Do you think I enjoy staring at you?" Ethan Blake's stubborn nature flared up. Regardless of whether she would push him off or not, he retorted with irritation. "Humph!" The mysterious woman snorted again. After a pause, she spoke to herself. "I saw you messing with those two men on the main road earlier. You seemed quick-witted, so I brought you here to help me." By now, Ethan Blake's initial fear had dissipated, and he was gradually adapting to the sensation of being high above the ground. He plopped down onto the divine vessel, turning his head to gaze at the sea of clouds outside, pretending not to hear the woman's words. However, the space on the divine vessel was limited. How could he possibly not hear her? Knowing this, the mysterious woman paid no mind and continued. In the Cloudwater Nation, there's a dead zone shrouded in dense energy year-round. The area is covered with swamps, and any cultivator who enters, regardless of their level, gets trapped in illusions and eventually turns into sludge. Only ordinary people have a chance to venture deep within and uncover its secrets. Not long ago, I obtained a map indicating that a precious pearl has appeared there. It is said to greatly enhance cultivation. Therefore, I need a clever, somewhat skilled ordinary person to retrieve it for me. Though Ethan Blake heard her clearly, he sneered and replied, "And why should I help you? Go find someone else." "You?" The mysterious woman raised her hand again, but paused midair. After pondering for a moment, she said, "Although I could easily find someone else, I feel in my heart that you are the most suitable. How about this? You help me retrieve what I want, and I'll gift you a treasure in return. What do you say?" "Not interested. Don't waste my time. Either kill me or let me go." Initially, when Ethan Blake saw this woman with her unparalleled beauty, a peerless enchantress, he felt a slight fondness for her. But her words and actions immediately destroyed all those feelings, leaving only annoyance in his heart. At this moment, he was suspended in midair, his life entirely at the mercy of the woman. Logic dictated that he should comply, at least until he returned to solid ground before confronting her. But Ethan Blake's stubborn nature flared up. He ignored all reasoning, even surprising himself. Normally, he was excellent at concealing his emotions. Why, then, did he lose his composure in front of this woman? Unexpected. You do have some backbone. The mysterious woman suddenly smiled, and in that instant, it was as if the ice melted, spring returned, and everything came back to life. A sight to dazzle anyone. Unfortunately, Ethan Blake's gaze was fixed into the distance, paying no attention to the beauty before him. "Hey! Even if you want to die, it won't be that easy. Even if you jump now, I'll just bring you back," the mysterious woman said. Ethan Blake furrowed his brow and finally turned his head, glaring at the mysterious woman. "Do as you please. Either way, I won't follow your orders. And another thing, aren't you fond of slapping people? Go ahead. I'm not afraid. You're quite something." The mysterious woman's expression shifted instantly. With her status and position, not to mention an ordinary mortal, even a powerful cultivator of the immortal Tao wouldn't dare address her with such insolence. Yet this young man before her, with every other sentence calling himself this old man, stirred a faint killing intent within her. She thought to herself, "Fine, I'll just find someone else." As this thought crossed her mind, a sharp glint of cold light flashed in her eyes. Ethan Blake sensed her killing intent, but instead of fear, a cold smile appeared on his face. He met her gaze head-on and said, "Go ahead. I've been meaning to visit my mother anyway. It'll give me an excuse to see her." Humph. To Ethan Blake's surprise, the mysterious woman's killing intent suddenly dissipated. Instead, she began scrutinizing him carefully, a trace of disdain curling her lips. This celestial maiden, do things differently from others. You want to die, but I won't let you. You refuse to go on my behalf, but I'll make sure you do." After speaking, her jade-like hand flipped over, and a ball of light the size of a child's fist appeared. Before Ethan Blake could react, the ball of light emitted a sharp sound and directly shot into his body. "Ouch!" Ethan Blake exclaimed, immediately feeling as if something foreign had entered his body, bringing an indescribable discomfort. Furious, he leaped up without caring that he was midair, and threw a punch straight at the woman's face. "Heh heh. Such amateurish moves, don't waste your energy. Wouldn't it be better to save your strength and retrieve the treasure for me? The mysterious woman raised her hand and pointed casually. Ethan Blake's body suddenly froze, then collapsed, sitting heavily on the divine boat. What spell have you cast on me? Heh heh. Naturally, it's a spell to make you obedient. The mysterious beauty let out a sinister laugh, her expression brimming with smugness. Ethan Blake was about to retort when he saw the mysterious beauty suddenly turn serious. She flicked her sleeve, and a glowing rope flew out, automatically binding Ethan Blake. At the same time, she adjusted her wide-brimmed conical hat, took a few steps to the front of the divine boat, and shouted loudly, "Whoever is hiding in the clouds, watching me for so long, what exactly is your intention?" "Ha ha. Nail me what's, so you've detected me after all. Fine, sneaking around isn't really my style anyway." A loud laugh echoed from within the clouds. Upon hearing this, Ethan Blake's expression changed drastically. He was all too familiar with this voice. Could it be? Chapter 42. Borrowing Strength. A loud laugh echoed from the clouds, followed by a handsome man stepping on a treasured sword, flying out and stopping in front of Shinjo. "I thought it was someone else, but it turns out to be the renowned Henry Brooks of Virtue Keep." Naomi Watts sneered coldly, though her tone betrayed a hint of caution toward Henry Brooks. Henry Brooks stood on the glowing flying sword, his robes fluttering in the wind. With his striking appearance and ethereal demeanor, he resembled an immortal. He chuckled and said, "Fairy Naomi, it has been 10 years since we last met in the mystic ice realm. If not for seeing your spirit pearl of Shinjo, I might not have recognized you." "Humph. Henry Brooks, stop beating around the bush. Just say it. What do you want from me?" Naomi Watts replied impatiently. "Ha ha. Fairy Naomi, pardon my boldness. The young man tied to your spirit pearl is the son of an old acquaintance of mine. His family faced a calamity, and he was captured by evildoers. I've searched for him for a long time, and only recently discovered he ended up in your hands. I hope you can do me the honor of releasing him to me." Henry Brooks glanced at Ethan Blake, nodding slightly to signal him to stay calm and not act rashly. Ethan Blake, bound tightly, felt a surge of fear. If he remained in Naomi Watts' hands, he might still have a chance to survive. But if he fell into Henry Brooks' grasp, his fate would be sealed. Though Henry Brooks outwardly seemed unaware of his true identity and mistook him for Richard Blake's son, Ethan couldn't be sure he hadn't seen through his disguise. Naomi Watts furrowed her brows and turned to look at Ethan Blake, her expression revealing surprise and a trace of unease. She had captured him on a whim, not expecting him to be connected to Virtue Keep. At this moment, although her strength was on par with Henry Brooks, it was unwise to provoke Virtue Keep over someone unrelated. After a moment of hesitation, Naomi Watts finally said, "Since Senior Brother Ming has spoken, how could I refuse? I will hand him over to you." "Then I am most grateful." Henry Brooks smiled, clasping his hands in a gesture of respect. "I don't agree." To their surprise, Ethan Blake suddenly shouted, leaving both of them stunned. Henry Brooks' expression darkened slightly, his tone laced with annoyance. "Ethan Blake, I was entrusted by the Northern Guardian King to retrieve you. Don't be ungrateful." "Heh heh. Fairy Naomi, isn't it true that you want me to retrieve a treasure for you? I now agree, unconditionally. Furthermore, I possess a shocking secret that I'll share with you, something you'll undoubtedly find intriguing. But there's one condition. Don't let this man take me away." Ethan Blake spoke loudly, having decided that staying with Naomi Watts was far safer than going with Henry Brooks. "What secret?" Naomi Watts moved swiftly, appearing in front of Ethan Blake. "Come closer," Ethan Blake said. "All right." Naomi Watts waited for the tension to ease, then moved closer to Ethan Blake. Ethan Blake whispered 2 words so softly they were almost inaudible. Naomi Watts' body immediately trembled, clearly shaken to her core. It took her a long moment to straighten up, remove the hood from her head, and turn to Henry Brooks. "Brother Ming, I sincerely apologize. He has refused to return with you, and I am left with no alternative." Henry Brooks' expression darkened. In the entire realm of cultivation, almost everyone showed him respect. Yet Naomi Watts, upon hearing some great secret, had instantly changed her stance, retracting her earlier words. It was truly humiliating. His face shifted through various emotions before finally settling into calmness. "What if I insist on taking him by force?" Henry Brooks said coldly. Naomi Watts' delicate face turned icy. Brother Ming, then it will depend on your skill. I've trained diligently for years, and only recently achieved the Golden Core stage. I wonder, what is your current level? I've heard that you reached the late Foundation Establishment stage 7 years ago. Surely, you must have advanced to the Golden Core stage by now? Compared to you, Lady Naomi, I am indeed lacking," Henry Brooks admitted. He had intended to use force to take Ethan Blake, but Naomi Watts had preemptively revealed her strength, clearly as a warning. From what he knew, Naomi Watts was merely 20 years old, yet she had already reached such a remarkable level. She was undoubtedly a prodigy. "In that case, I'll take my leave." Naomi Watts smiled faintly, ignoring Henry Brooks entirely. Instead, she turned to Ethan Blake and said, "You'd better not deceive me, or I'll make you wish you were dead." With that, the divine spirit arc trembled and shot off like a streak of light. As the arc disappeared into the distance, a flicker of killing intent flashed in Henry Brooks' eyes. He muttered to himself, "Damn it, this witch is far too powerful. Only 20 years old, and she's already mastered the Golden Core stage. I've wasted so much time over the years building my influence." The divine spirit arc sped through the air for a long time before finally slowing down. By now, they were 1,000 miles away from where they had encountered Henry Brooks. So Henry Brooks doesn't have as high a cultivation level as Naomi Watts, Ethan Blake thought to himself, secretly relieved. As these thoughts ran through his mind, he glanced at Naomi Watts. At that moment, Naomi Watts was seated cross-legged on the ark, her eyes closed as she meditated. Controlling the ark at such high speeds had clearly consumed a significant amount of energy. A while later, Naomi Watts exhaled deeply, releasing a stream of murky air. She opened her eyes and noticed Ethan Blake staring at her. Instantly, her expression turned furious. "If you keep staring, I'll gouge your eyes out." Finally revealed, now I know where to find the absolute jade. Ethan Blake chuckled, teasingly. Just moments ago, he had leaned close to Naomi Watts' ear and whispered the words, "Absolute jade." Instantly, she made the decision not to hand him over to Henry Brooks. From this, it was clear how renowned the absolute jade was, and how irresistible its allure could be. "Stop being so cunning. Speak up, where is the absolute jade?" Naomi Watts demanded. She only half believed Ethan Blake's words. However, for the sake of the absolute jade, she would risk anything. Even if it meant making enemies of Virtue Keep or the entire realm of cultivation, it would still be worth it. "Let me go first. Also, is this spirit feather divine arc of yours reliable or not? Ming's sword flies incredibly fast. If he catches up, things will spiral out of control," Ethan Blake said, twisting his body. The rope binding him was forged from some unknown material. Once tied, it automatically tightened with every struggle, now constricting him to the point of excruciating pain. My spirit feather divine arc is an unparalleled treasure. Don't think that Henry Brooks' exalted status in Virtue Keep makes his sword superior. It's not even 1/10 as valuable as my ark. Naomi Watts scoffed. With a wave of her hand, the rope flew back to her palm, glimmered briefly, and then disappeared. Ethan Blake stretched his arms and legs, feeling a sense of relief before speaking. First, tell me where exactly you want me to go. The absolute jade hides a great secret. It's not something that can be easily obtained. If the pearl you want me to retrieve can enhance your strength, then our chances will increase. Fine, no problem. The place I want you to go is called the Phantom Marshes, located at the heart of the Cloudwater Kingdom. Naomi Watts replied decisively. Before Ethan Blake could interject, she added, You'd better recount how you came to know the secret of the absolute jade. Don't even think about deceiving me. Of course. Ethan Blake adjusted his thoughts and began recounting events from 7 years ago. However, his story was a mix of truth and lies, emphasizing the part where Henry Brooks had pursued him. As for where the absolute jade was truly hidden, he repeated the fabricated story he told Matthew Gray and Toby Bryan, claiming it was stored in a certain temple, with its exact location known only to him. Naomi Watts found his account logical and convincing. Reflecting on the two cultivators, Matthew Gray and Toby Bryan, who were traveling with a mortal by carriage toward the north, and the inexplicable appearance of Henry Brooks, she pieced everything together. This led her to believe Ethan Blake's words with 90% certainty. Her heart brimmed with excitement. No one knew the true secret hidden within the absolute jade. But everyone understood that obtaining it would allow one to surpass all major sects, dominate the world, and gain immense benefits for their cultivation. Who would have thought that casually capturing someone would turn out to be such a heaven-sent opportunity? Naomi Watts mused. Ethan Blake observed her elation, silently calculating his next move. Phantom Marshes, as mentioned by Naomi Watts, was something he had seen in the royal archives, and he had some knowledge about it. Just as Naomi Watts said, Phantom Marshes was not only a forbidden land, but also an incredibly mystical place. Cultivators were fundamentally unable to enter. It was said that once a cultivator stepped into Phantom Marshes, they would become trapped in endless illusions until they perished within them. As for ordinary mortals, they wouldn't experience the illusions, but faced no less danger. The marshes were filled with treacherous swamps, and a single misstep could lead to sinking. Without someone to rescue them, they would drown. Thus, Phantom Marshes, located in the extreme northern lands, was a place that turned everyone pale with fear, and no one dared to take the risk. Humph. If cultivators can't enter Phantom Marshes, then this is my chance to escape, Ethan Blake resolved in his heart. With a map to guide him, there shouldn't be any life-threatening danger in Phantom Marshes. He could find another path through the marshes and flee far away. Although the divine spirit boat slowed its flight, it was still incredibly fast. In just 3 or 4 hours, it had crossed the border of Wu Kingdom and entered the territory of Yunshui Nation. Landing in a desolate area, Naomi Watts retracted the spirit boat, donned her hood once more, and prepared to walk to a nearby small town to rest for the night. Tomorrow, she would head to Phantom Marshes. Ethan Blake followed behind Naomi Watts, his gaze fixed on her swaying figure, her slender waist moving gracefully, filling his eyes with admiration. His heart couldn't help but race. At nearly 15 years old, he had started to understand matters between men and women, and his youthful heart was beginning to stir. Swallowing hard, he couldn't help but sigh inwardly. This woman was born with unmatched beauty, her appearance peerless, but her temperament was unpredictable. Ruthless and merciless, she could kill without batting an eye, truly deserving the title of a demoness. What left people speechless was that this woman's cultivation level was so high that even Henry Brooks treated her with caution. One couldn't help but admit that the world was indeed full of wonders, leaving people in awe. Sigh. If only she were as sweet as Sophia, how great would that be? A strange thought surfaced in Ethan Blake's mind. Hey, you're following behind me, plotting something, aren't you? Let me tell you, don't even think about escaping. I've already embedded a sword aura into your body. If I wish, I can make you suffer a fate worse than death at any moment. Naomi Watts, seemingly sensing Ethan Blake's gaze, assumed he was planning an escape and spoke coldly. I just want to ask, how powerful is the Golden Core stage exactly? Ethan Blake quickly caught up, trying to start a conversation. Naomi Watts' figure was incredibly alluring, causing his adolescent heart to race and his thoughts to wander. Seeing Ethan Blake catching up, Naomi Watts let out a cold snort and said, You'll naturally have the chance to find out. #### Chapter 43 Phantom Marshes, Part 1. Naomi Watts and Ethan Blake, two individuals in an unnamed small town, stayed overnight. The next day, they borrowed the Wooling Divine vessel and continued heading deeper into the interior of the Cloudwater Kingdom. The Cloudwater Kingdom is located on the northernmost frontier, vast in size, covering an area 4 to 5 times larger than the Wu Kingdom. However, to the north of the Cloudwater Kingdom lies an endless expanse of glaciers, stretching into the unknown, with no one able to determine its true extent. Thus, despite its vast territory, the Cloudwater Kingdom suffers from scarce resources.